Good evening. Hi, I'm Liz Krueger, the Senator from the 28th District. Welcome. We have these webinars frequently, but we have lots of different issues, and tonight I think it's a particularly interesting and important issue. We're titling it Looking Out for Each Other, Bystander Intervention Training. And we're New Yorkers, so we understand what this actually can mean in our lives. But before we get to the very terrific group of people who are going to be presenting, I would like to go over the basics for people who aren't familiar with us. One, you can be watching this on Zoom or Facebook or calling into the town hall discussion. If you're on the phone, all you really can do is listen. But if you are on Zoom or Facebook, you can turn on closed captioning, which allows you to see text of what everyone's saying if you have any kind of hearing impairments. So if you're on Zoom, click on live transcript in the meeting controls to start viewing closed captioning. And if you're on Facebook Live, you'll see a settings button in the bottom right-hand corner of the video. Click closed caption CC to start viewing closed captionings. I want to make a few announcements before we start tonight. We're always talking about COVID. You just can't get away from it. This Tuesday, the FDA Advisory Committee discussed whether to authorize the Pfizer vaccination for children ages 5 to 11. The vote was 17-0 with one abstention to approve a 2-dose series 3 weeks apart. Please note that the first step in a 4-step process, the FDA must issue formal authorization. The CDC ACIP will meet and take a vote next week. Then the CDC director must also issue formal authorization before vaccines can administer the Pfizer vaccination to children aged 5 to 11. So don't rush to get in line quite yet, but get ready, and you might start talking to your child about that they're going to have, a couple of shots, vaccines. Frankly, they're very used to this. They get all kinds of vaccines when they're young. Once approved, you'll be able to find vaccine sites in the New York City Vaccine Finder. And you can also check if your child's pediatrician will be administering the vaccine. The Vaccine Finder link is in the chat. The New York City Department of Health has issued guidance for how to celebrate Halloween as safely as possible, including wearing a face mask over your costume if you are unvaccinated and avoiding crowds. It's a little bit of a challenge, but I noticed the kids are following the mask rules incredibly well. A link to the guidance can be found in the chat as well. And now we'll be moving to tonight's event, Looking Out for Each Other, Bystander Intervention Training. You should know the event is being recorded, and so everyone who is RSVP'd for tonight's event will receive an email of the link to the video a couple of days after the event, and others will be able to find this through my website. Many of us celebrate the diversity in New York City because we believe that the people of diverse backgrounds and beliefs are what always has and always will make our city great. Last summer, as the number of bias incidents continued to rise in the city and across the country, I held a virtual town hall about the increase in hate crimes and what we could do to lower the temperature. At that event, I learned that the New York City Commission on Human Rights provides trainings offering tools and strategies to help us respond safely when we witness bias events and discrimination. So I'm very pleased that I'm able to sponsor this evening's town hall with the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And we're going to be hearing from the new agency commissioner, an old friend of mine, Annabelle Palma, but apparently the mayor has assigned her something else. So I'm not sure we're going to have her tonight, but we will have other guests from the Human Rights Commission. And one of our first will be Jonah Boyarin, the Jewish Communities Liaison and Associate Human Rights Specialist at the Commission. And then he will be joined by, a little later, Ryan DuBois, Associate Human Rights Specialist, who will actually provide the Bystander Intervention training. After the presentations, I will moderate a Q&A portion of the event. And as always, we've gotten questions in advance from many people, but if you are on Zoom or Facebook Live, you'll be able to feed in additional questions through the chat and or Q&A sections, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So for now, I would like to turn it over to Jonah Boyarin to start us off. Good evening, Jonah.
Good evening, Senator Krueger. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much to Senator Krueger and to all her staff for helping set up this event. We're really glad to be here with you all. This is really a big part of why our agency exists, is to be here for New Yorkers like everyone assembled on this call to help us know how to all be better New Yorkers, how to look out for each other, make this the best city it can be. I'm about to pull up our PowerPoint slides, so bear with me a moment. So thanks again for being here. This training is a collaboration between the New York City Commission on Human Rights and the Center for Anti-Violence Education, CAE. CAE is a community partner of ours that we work with in all kinds of ways. Leaders across the city in anti-violence work who have been doing this work for several decades and have helped pioneer some of the best strategies for bystander intervention in New York City and nationwide.
Sorry to interrupt, Jonah. We don't have your slide deck up.
Oh, okay. Let me do that then. Okay, are we good now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. So mission for the Commission on Human Rights is twofold. First of all, we have a mandate to enforce the city's human rights law. So I'm going to tell you for a moment about what that is. It's not the focus of our training today, but it's a really important part of your rights as a New Yorker that everyone should be educated about. So New York City has one of the oldest and strongest human rights laws, local human rights laws in the city. This is a civil set of protections that makes sure that a whole huge number of categories of identities are protected against discrimination. So for instance, if somebody is disabled and has a landlord who refuses from the outset to consider putting in a accessible shower that someone can take a wheelchair into or something like that. Well, people are, New Yorkers have the right under the human rights law to a reasonable accommodation as a tenant with disabilities. And you can come to us if your landlord is not working with you reasonably about that. Or if somebody experiences another form of discrimination in employment, someone says, whether explicitly or through a pattern of repeated choices that you figure out, an employer is not hiring people above a certain age, or they're not hiring Black people or Latinx people. Well, those are all illegal under the New York City human rights law, and you may very well be entitled to compensation, and also not just compensation, but on our end, the enforcement of the law to make sure that the landlord or the employer or whoever it might be makes that change to make sure that we're treating everyone equally going forward. So that's kind of our human rights law, and our law enforcement bureau enforces that law. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to put up a slide that gives you some direct lines to make complaints if you have had anything come up. But the real basic thing I can tell you for now is you can always call 311 and ask for the City Commission on Human Rights. 311, ask for the City Commission on Human Rights. Okay. So that's sort of part one of our mandate. Part two is fostering positive intergroup relations. New York City is such a beautiful experiment, right? People from all walks of life, all ages, all backgrounds, from all parts of the world, all religions. We're an experiment to see, can people live well together in such diversity. In fact, in finding what is the strength in our diversity. So our agency works to just help us be the best New York we can be in that way. One of those components is educating the public about parts of the human rights law. And another component is just saying, what tools do I need and do you need as an everyday New Yorker to be able to look out for one another, to make sure that, when something does go wrong, when something does go down, that we're doing the best we can in that moment to be our best selves, best neighbors, best city. So that's the commission's mission. Again, our partner on this training, the Center for Anti-Violence Education, CAE, their mission is to prevent, intervene, and heal from hate violence in our communities through educational programs that center the experiences of people most marginalized. So we have some community agreements here. Just going to give you a moment to read through them for yourselves. Okay, and as I'm going to read them out loud, I would love it if you're able to, if you have access to the chat function, type into the chat. I will be able to see it, as will my co-panelists, the word yes, if you can agree to these. So first agreement, receive knowledge and opinions with an open mind. So just having that open mind of like, maybe I'm going to learn something new today. Might not agree with it at first, when I learn something new today. 2, accept and expect a lack of closure. So what that means is this is kind of a lifelong skill, and we're just starting to learn it today. I think you will walk away with some useful skills, but it's not going to be everything you need for every situation. It's an ongoing process. Number 3, if you participate, submit questions, whatever it might be, please use I statements to speak to your own experience and truth, meaning rather than saying, this is how it is for everyone, just say, well, when I go on the street or when I intervene, speaking from your own experience, knowing that we have diverse experiences here. And finally, stories stay and lessons leave. What do I mean by that? Well, we might get questions or we might hear things from presenters that are really specific anecdotes. And those are something that are really just for this space. There's not something we don't want to repeat outside of this training. It's just for our training purposes. But the lessons leave, right? So without giving specific identifying details, we can learn from the situations and share the learnings with other people. Okay, so those are our community agreements for today. Here's our agenda. So we already talked about the missions of CAE and CCHR. Number 2, talked about community agreements. We're going over the agenda and goals right now. We're going to do a grounding, sort of like to settle ourselves a little bit. Then we're going to talk about some of the background, 4 Eyes in Power, for thinking about, why do people harass one another or commit hate violence to one another. Then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of how to intervene. So what are some of the barriers that we want to consider? What are some of the practical tools that we're going to do? And we're going to go through some scenarios to kind of practice applying those tools. We'll have some synthesis, and then we'll have a Q&A where we'll be rejoining Senator Krueger, who will be moderating. So just to remind you again that as questions come up, you can type them into the chat that goes to the panelists, and we will, if possible, answer those questions during the Q&A. So our goals. Learn how to be an upstander using before, during, and after de-escalation strategies. So before, during, and after situations, what can I do to de-escalate and make the situation safer and more manageable? Number 2, understand oppression and power. So, what are these sort of like the basics of fundamentals of why people choose to hurt one another or have the power to do so in these situations? Number 3, identify our own positionality and potential barriers to intervening. So who am I? How safe am I in a particular situation? How do people perceive me? What am I positioned to do safely and effectively, and what might I need to step back from or ask for help with? And number 4, go over issues responding to incidents of anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant xenophobia, anti-Sikh xenophobia, and anti-Black racism. So some of the, not all, but some of the common forms of harassment and hate violence that we unfortunately see. So we're going to do a little bit of a grounding before we start. Some people might be familiar with this, or some of us might be new. This is loaded material. It in one way or another, it can affect us, and there's no shame in that. That's actually just a reflection of caring about one another and having life experiences. So we just want to take care of those feelings as they come up, knowing that they might. So first of all, I want to say, if there's at any point where you say, you know what, the topic being discussed or the scenario example or the anecdote, it's just a little too upsetting for me to listen to right now, you can put me on mute. You can take a break for 5 minutes. You can do some jumping jacks. You can drink a glass of water. You can just sit quietly. All of those are really great options to take care of yourself, and they're not separate from this training. They're actually part of the practice, because part of what we're working on in bystander intervention is recognizing our positionality, realizing how do we feel in that moment, what are we capable of, and what are we going to do knowing that. So that's a really great practice. Those are all great practices if you need to do that. And we're also just going to ground a little bit right now in our breath and bodies, just to try to be as attentive and present and ideally as calm as possible while working through interesting but challenging material together. So I'm going to invite everyone, if you're sitting, find yourself to gently sit up in any way that feels comfortable and safe for your back. So not too puffed up, not too slouched over, but just what feels like a natural, comfortable posture for you at this moment, or you're most comfortable, you're most natural that you can do in this moment. Find that posture. Feel the seat underneath you, or if you're standing, your feet underneath you. So what does that seat feel like underneath you? Really pay attention to that. If you're able, just tap your feet gently. Just tap them a little bit on the ground, just to feel it. Help us notice what's happening right now. And then let them relax. See what that feels like. How do your feet feel just resting against the ground? If you feel comfortable, close your eyes a moment. Take a deep breath in. If you prefer to keep your eyes open, you can do that too. Let the breath out if you have not yet. Take another long, slow sip in. Let that exhalation slowly go. You can open your eyes if they're closed. Come back to yourself. And we're going to proceed with the presentation. So first of all, our foundations. What is oppression? What do we mean by that? Well, oppression is a pattern or a system of inequality that gives power and privileges to members of one group at the expense of another, right? So, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, ageism, those are all different kinds of oppression. And there's 4 different kinds: ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. Ideological is the ideas of it, what people say. Interpersonal is how, a boss and their employee treat one another, or a landlord and a tenant, or just 2 people on the street. Institutional is, what are the outcomes in our schools? What are our prisons doing? How are those fair or unfair to one group or the other? And internalized is when we get all those messages about one group being superior to another, how does that affect our internal landscape, how we understand the world? So here's some examples of ideological oppression. Here's some sites where we see institutional, schools, hospitals, immigration services, interpersonal, student and teacher, parent to parent. Internalized, we might have feelings of shame, unworthiness, or superiority or judgment of others that we might not want to have. So one example of the roots of oppression, one way of thinking about this holistically, thinking about anti-immigrant bias or oppression or xenophobia. So an overt form of that might be saying like, oh, you don't belong here, right? That would be an overt interpersonal form. Or anti-immigration laws and policies, those are institutional forms, detention camps, deportations. And the patterns or structures that underlie that include xenophobia, Orientalism, nationalism, settler colonialism, among others. The underlying messages that really drive xenophobia, we're thinking or treating immigrants as somehow less than us, not belonging, being fundamentally different, thinking that certain jobs belong, are deserved by one group of people or not the other. The belief that you're more entitled to land and living, that I am more entitled to something than immigrants are, or that immigrants are here to steal jobs. Those are sort of underlying messages that drive that. So corresponding to the 4 types of oppression, there's 4 types of power. Power over is sort of coercive. I tell someone else what to do because I want it for my benefit at their expense. That's the most traditional power and the most harmful. Power with is when you and I get to work together, start a project together, when we do a training together, when we start a community garden together, when we help pass a more fair immigration law together. Power 2 is having access to change the world around us. And power within is a sense of ourselves as having agency, as being empowered. So what are some potential barriers that come up in street level or other kinds of harassment or violence situations? So first of all, a big one is fear for your own safety. This is something that comes up in all of our trainings. How do I do the right thing while looking out for myself? That's a really big question. That's one that we'll just start to explore today. Another is, I want to help, but I don't know what to do. Well, we're going to try to pick up some skills for that today. And again, I want to emphasize that it takes time. I often compare this stuff to a first aid or a CPR training. The more that you practice it, the more it's just in your body and in your habit and mind, so that, God forbid, if or when the moment comes up, you actually find yourself more readily accessible, knowing what to do. It can be difficult in a high adrenaline moment. It takes practice. Don't want to make the situation worse, right? Often we're like, oh, this is messed up and I could exacerbate things. And that is a real risk. So that's something we're going to teach around today as well. And fear of exposure, well, if I put myself out there, I don't know, am I going to be caught on video and it's going to be on Twitter and everyone's going to see me doing what I thought was my best, but everyone's going to judge it? That can be a feeling that freezes us or discourages us from acting. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So here's what to consider before intervention. So first of all, breathe. So when something's happening, our adrenaline goes up, we see something surprising and disturbing on the street or in an interaction between colleagues or in a business, our adrenaline goes up, and the best response is to try to clear our bodies and minds a little bit, taking a few slow breaths. You might not remember to do it, but if you do, it can really help. Being aware of your triggers. What makes you react verbally or physically with anger, sadness, fear, etc.? So, well, what are the things that upset me? What are the situations that are overwhelming for me or get me to really start acting more angry and aggressive? Knowing myself in that way so that I can be a more responsible upstander in that moment and de-escalate and take care of myself as well. Positioning yourself for safety. So, just having that situational awareness, that kind of New Yorkers awareness. There's always a lot happening around us in the city. And, you spend enough years here, you just start to be kind of like, have an eye in the back of your head or just kind of notice what's going on a little bit extra. So when the situation comes up, taking that extra moment to be like, where are my exits here? Where are other people around me that feel potentially safe and helpful or are, God forbid, contributing to the threat? There's a few physical things we can do. So one thing is that we can just keep our hands loosely by our sides. So instead, we don't want to do fists because that escalates, that can make a more aggressive situation. And we don't want to be hiding our hands in our pockets because that makes us less ready to protect ourselves if we need to, but having a nice, loose, easy stance with our hands by our sides. Also, ideally, we don't want to just, if we end up interacting with someone who's potentially aggressive, we don't want to go right up into their physical space, just close enough that we can talk to them if that's what we choose to do. We don't necessarily want to face them at 12 o'clock straight on, but we might put ourselves at just a little bit of an angle so that we can see a wider scope around us, and it puts us in a more stable stance. If we're standing at just a little bit of an angle with one foot kind of diagonal behind and one foot in front, it's a more stable and a more mobile stance so we can adjust to the situation. And I want to emphasize again, it's going to be your choice in every situation, whether you even walk up in the first place. We also want to convey confident body language, just show, yep, I'm here and I belong here and I know what I'm doing. And that can be a fake it till you make it kind of situation because it helps the whole situation go better. People respond to confidence. Confidence actually can de-escalate if it's paired with someone who has a non-aggressive de-escalating approach like we are all trying to do. And last, positionality. Just, remember, it's like we're all in different situations. I'm a white guy, right? So I'm like less likely, doesn't mean it can't happen, but I'm less likely to get pushed around by another guy in the street than say a woman or a woman of color is. It's just less likely to look at me and say, oh, this is the kind of person that I can get away with pushing around. I also wear a yarmulke in public. So there are certain situations where if someone is saying something, anti-Semitic or has some, kind of paraphernalia on them that display that attitude, where I might be more cautious and more because they might want to target me more. Everyone's mix of those things is really different based on our situations, and you're the ones who have to decide that best for yourself. So, we'll be speaking to our own experiences and as much as possible, leaving you room to interpret for yourself. So, I'm going to go back a minute. So in a moment, we're going to get to some of the discrete strategies for de-escalation. De-escalation basically means, helping calm down a situation. We're going to get to some concrete strategies for that. Before we do, I'm just going to share two anecdotes with you. 2 times that I have been a bystander and intervened. And I'm going to tell them to you. One of them that I think I didn't handle very well, and one of them that I handled well. And as we go through some of these tools in a bit, I'll be asking you to, just keep in your mind, what are the tools as they come up and I'm learning about them that Jonah was referring to there? And also, what are the tools that he didn't use and could have used successfully in the situation he described in retrospect? So the first situation was some years ago. I think at that point, had maybe one bystander intervention training. So I'd had a small amount of preparation. And I was on West 14th Street walking with a friend. And all of a sudden, as we're walking up the street, there's a man and a woman, and the woman is saying, "Get away from me, get away from me," to the man, get away from me, get away from me. He's kind of pushing at her, pulling at her a little bit. It's not striking her, but he's in her space, making physical contact she doesn't want. And she said, "Get away from me, I don't want this." And they said a couple other things where I could tell that they were in a romantic relationship. They knew each other well, and something had happened where she wanted him to get away and he was being violent. So I walked up about 5 feet from them and from him and said to him in a really loud voice, "She said, get away from you, get away." And he kind of looked at me and then ignored me and got back. And I just repeated this. "She said, get away from you, get away. She said, get away from you, get away." And people were like walking by us on the street and just, unfortunately doing that, crowd effect thing where they're like, "Well, I guess someone else is taking care of it and I don't want to get involved." So it's kind of just me and him. I just kept repeating this. And this couple started walking up the street. And I didn't know what to do. So I followed them at 5 feet. She's still saying, stop, get away. So I just repeating it. She said, "Get away, get away." And he turns and he curses at me, says, "F off, go away." And I'm just still following them at a distance and saying that. And at some point, he turns around, says, "Get away, get away." And "It's not your business." And I said, "She said, get away from you, get away." And he ran up to me and took a swing at me. And I was able to dodge it, didn't hit me. But at that point, I backed off because I was like, I'm not sure how to proceed in this situation. They started walking up the block. I saw a couple of cops on the street. I told them what had happened because I had ran out of ideas for what to do myself. But the cops were busily handling something else. And by the time they went to look for this couple, they weren't able to find him. So that's the first story. In case you couldn't tell, that's the one that I felt like I didn't handle very well, wasn't knowing too much what to do at the time. Second interaction was just a couple of years ago. I was riding the subway and I was sitting down, and right across the subway from me in the opposite seats, there was a woman who was listening to music or reading, I can't remember. And there was a man kind of hovering above her. And this man who's hovering above her just started kind of getting a little closer and closer to her. That's all he's doing physically. He just got closer and closer to her. He started talking to her and talking to her, and I'm just kind of sitting there and reading, but I'm noticing like, it's kind of a weird conversation. She's not responding at all. She hasn't invited at all. And I just start looking more and more at her body language, was kind of shrunken in her seat and uncomfortable. And I said to myself, you know what? I don't want to be dealing with this on my way to my, to work right now. I'm tired and this is scary, but it's happening and it's happening to her. So, what can I do? So I just, I started looking more steadily and just looking straight at her. And at some point she noticed me and she made just really strong eye contact with me and just kind of, I don't know how to say it, but, with her face expressed, "Help, this is messed up." And so what I did was I got up and I went over to the guy who was bothering her. And I said to him, "Excuse me, do you know which way is Coney Island?" He said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, do you know, I'm trying to get to Coney Island. What's the train to Coney Island? Someone told me this is the train to Coney Island." And he said, No, this isn't the train to Coney Island. What you want to do is you want to switch at 42nd Street. You need the orange lines." And I said, oh, so I go uptown at 42nd Street? And he said, no, you don't really know what you're doing here, do you? You got to switch to the downtown in Brooklyn. And we just kind of kept going like that. And it kind of burst the bubble where it took away his attention from her. And after a few minutes of this, he actually got off a few stops later. And then she and I had our own conversation where she didn't want to talk about, what had just happened. I was like, "Are you okay?" And she was like, "I'm fine." But she wanted to talk about what I was reading at the time. And so we ended up talking for about 15 minutes for that. And she said, thank you to me a couple times and left. And that was the whole interaction. So that's the other one. So now let's get into some of the tools. What was I missing? And maybe what was I using in the first situation and what was I using in the second situation? So there are 4 Ds. This is adapted from a group called Hollaback, 4 Ds for bystander intervention. So these are all choices. Never have to do all of them or even any of them. So choice 1, direct. You can respond directly to the aggressor or physically intervene if necessary, right? You can say, stop this, don't do that. Or even physically. For instance, there was a horrible incident last year of someone trying to push a woman on the train tracks because she was Asian as part of anti-Asian hate. And a group of people just went and sort of like, a whole mass of New Yorkers, went and just grabbed them and stopped him. You can also use a combination of direct and delegate like they did. So once the interveners made sure she was safe, then they went and got the police. But in the moment, they were the ones there and he was trying to push her on the tracks. A less high stakes example might be stepping in to correct someone when someone's misgendered. Someone says, oh, she likes to, and the person's like, actually, I want you to refer to me as they, not she. And so you could just say, yeah, that's what they use. They use they, that's what we're going to use here because we want to be respectful. Delegate. So delegate is you can look around you and say, okay, this is a situation. This is the risk. Who can help me here? So pointing at someone and saying, hey, before I go say anything, you take your phone out and document this. Or saying, hey, you, go get help from the subway conductor. Or if you're in a bus, the bus driver or fellow passengers. Distract. So distracting someone could be, let's say like someone's being harassed. You could just like draw a lot of attention to yourself in a non-aggressive way. So get creative. You could say, maybe, oh gosh, someone stole my wallet. Who sees my wallet? And then everyone's suddenly looking at that, and their attention is drawn away. You can be silly. You can be ridiculous. You can start singing a really loud, weird song where everyone's looking at you like, who's this weird person? But it can kind of diffuse that bubble that can happen when it's just 2 people. One of whom's harassing each other and everyone else is uninvolved, doing that crowd effect. The last D is document. So it can be really powerful, I think, as we've seen in the George Floyd case and elsewhere, to, if possible, record something. But we have to do this carefully. So you might want to record the situation or delegate someone to, but before you share it with anyone else, you have to get the consent of the person who is being attacked. Right? Because what if they're an undocumented immigrant? They maybe are not someone who wants 1 million views of who they are on the internet. It could actually endanger their documentation situation. Or maybe someone, it's a domestic violence situation and intimate violence. People know each other. Well, they might be putting themselves at more risk to get hurt again. So you will always want to ask permission first. And the last thing to add on to the 4 Ds here is, again, just, check in with that person who was harmed after the incident. Because if you only do this, right? If you only do this, you would still be doing a really important thing because it demonstrates to the survivor that their well-being matters, right? In that moment when a woman is getting beat up by a guy, when an Asian person or a Jew or a Black person, whoever it might be, is getting attacked because of who they are or who we are, that's a moment where we might start to believe, maybe I matter less. And that's something we can help fix in that moment, or something we can help support the healing of in that moment, is just by saying, hey, how are you? That was so messed up. What do you need? So here's some really concrete de-escalation strategies to use. There's a mnemonic for remembering them called gambling. So G, get to we. So instead of being like, you need to cut that out, then you can say, hey, we all want to be respectful here, or hey, I can tell we're feeling upset, but what can we do about it? So that it kind of draws the aggressor into problem solve with you and identify with you. O, or rather A, offer alternatives. So you could say to someone, hey, look, I can tell we're upset here, but I'm glad to talk to you. Do you want to talk to me about it? What upset you? What's upsetting us here? Do you want to talk to me about it? Match and lead to step it down. So if someone's screaming at someone else, a slur or a threat or something, it's actually more effective if we speak to them to first start by matching that tone, right? By saying, hey, right? Start at that, and then we start to bring it down a little. So, hey, what do we need to resolve this situation? Something like that, right? So starting at the same matched volume and even intensity, not aggressive, but volume and intensity, and then bringing it down, because we're just Homo sapiens works that way. We just when someone imitates us, we start to imitate them. So when the aggressor feels like they're being matched, they're going to start to cue into you and start to tone it down when you tone it down, or they may. It works a lot of the time. Broken record, repeating the same thing a lot of times, like, hey, we need a better outcome to the situation, or hey, we all want to be respectful here, or hey, this isn't safe, or hey, we're all watching this. We all need to do better here. We need to stop. Lose to win, just basically pick your battle. You're not going to win every fight, just not, and sometimes you're going to say, I'm not going to use a more proactive strategy here. I'm going to use a less proactive one because of what my own position, my own risks, or just the intensity of what's happening. I statements. So rather than saying, you're being racist, you're messed up right now, you could say, look, hey, I want us to be safe here. I don't feel comfortable with how you're talking to her, something like that. And name the behavior rather than describing the person. So rather than saying like, hey, you're sexist, or hey, you're being sexist. Instead of describing the behavior, it's like, hey, that was sexist. And we're all trying to be respectful here, right? That's not who we are. Or, hey, that was racist, and we're not racist here, right? That's not what we're trying to do. Let's see if we can talk about it, to kind of give them that little bit of room to not be defensive, to not be ashamed, and to say, right, it was the behavior which I want to adjust. It's not me that's messed up. Even if honestly they are racist and they are doing really racist stuff, we want to focus on behavior for the sake of de-escalation. So little notes, just for safety's sake, do not approach an aggressor from behind if you choose to approach them at all, or get really directly up in their face, because that might escalate. Again, instead we want to approach them where they can see, have a nice, loose, easy diagonal stance some feet away from them. And get creative. The bottom line is experiment, judge for yourself what's safe for you and what you're willing and able to do, and what's right, what the situation calls for. There's not one answer for all situations. So with that, I'm going to hand off to my colleague, Ryan, who Senator Krueger introduced earlier, to talk us through some practical scenarios.
Thank you, Jonah. Jonah reviewed a lot of really important information, including the specific tactics and strategies that a bystander can use in an intervention. So now we're going to review some particular scenarios to practice how to apply those tools in a particular scenario. So the way we're going to do this is there's a few scenarios. I'm going to read each one and then allow folks a few minutes to just think, maybe write, and put their responses in the Q&A box. And then we'll move through the remainder of the scenarios. And once we've gone through all the scenarios, we will review all the tools and all the different responses that folks have responded with. So we'll begin with scenario 1. You're on the bus. A young Asian girl gets on the bus and another passenger begins to shout, "Why would you let her on the bus? You're putting our safety at risk." He proceeds to shout racist remarks and begins spraying Lysol spray on the Asian passenger. How can you intervene in this situation? So again, recall all of the different tools that Jonah described on his section of the presentation. And I'll give folks about 2 minutes to just brainstorm, if you have a pen and paper with you, or if you'd like to put in the Q&A, what response that you think would be most adequate in this particular scenario. And then we'll move on after a couple minutes. Okay, I think, Jonah, let's take a look at scenario 2. A Black lesbian couple are walking down the sidewalk holding hands. They come across a group of men. The men begin to taunt them, call them slurs, and say things that are graphic in nature and make lewd gestures relating to their genitals. The couple does not engage with them, but picks up their pace. They thankfully find themselves in front of a bodega and a pizzeria with people hanging outside. Questions: can others outside the bodega and pizzeria do anything? And also, what would you do if you were one of the people outside the bodega? So give folks another minute or two to respond here. All right, and Jonah, let's take a look at the next one. So scenario 3, you're walking home from work and see an Orthodox Jewish boy walking home from school with his older sister near Central Park. A jogger coming their way stops, spits on him, and calls him a slur. He tells the boy and his sister to get out of the neighborhood and that they are not wanted there. How can you intervene as someone on the street? Okay, so as Jonah had mentioned in the chat, there was some really great responses. So I'm just gonna run through and identify some of the tools that people suggested. So one person suggested in the case of the first scenario, in the incident on the bus, asking the bus driver to stop the bus. Perhaps the shock of the bus not moving could interrupt the situation. I think that would be a good example of delegating. So in that case, delegating to the bus driver. Attempting to distract, asking someone to assist you in intervening, excellent. Asking someone to call 911, definitely great as well. So yeah, these are all definitely excellent examples using the tools that we reviewed earlier. Looking at the next scenario, the two girls walking down the street and the situation outside of the bodega. Tried to pull the girl into a safer place. Absolutely. So that's a good example, again, as we mentioned, potentially exiting the situation. Engaging them in conversation. So that could also serve as a distraction, definitely, rather than in this case necessarily naming the behavior, but just acknowledging the individuals, beginning a conversation that could be adequate to distract the harassment that's taking place, definitely. Folks also said trying to protect or shield in the incident in the bus as well, attempting to protect or shield the woman who's the recipient of the aggression. So a direct intervention, absolutely. Again, folks said, yeah, making in scenario 2, again, trying to make small talk, just talking about pizza or the weather or something like that, letting the folks know that that they're supported, absolutely. So again, that can be a good example of distraction as well. Another interesting comment was asking the couple if it's okay to intervene. So I think that's important as well. So trying to seek the consensus of the individuals before staging a certain type of intervention. I think that could definitely be helpful as well. So with regard to scenario 3, this was an excellent example as well. Someone said take a photo of the jogger. So here we have an example of documentation. That's excellent as well. Speak to the jogger. Using we terms. So excellent point as well. So again, rather than using a type of accusatory you language, which could potentially escalate the situation, using we language to engage them and de-escalate the situation, reporting it to the police as soon as possible. Someone else mentioned helping the boy clean up and letting him know that he's supported, that if he needs any resources or anything. So some really important things there at the checking in, as Jonah mentioned as well. So we're seeing a lot of really, really great responses here. So I definitely want to thank everyone for their participation in this section. I think a lot of the tools that we've discussed tonight were employed really well in these scenarios, and that's a really great sign. Hopefully, folks will not have to use these scenarios in a real situation, but definitely they are available to you. So thank you so much for participating in that exercise.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Jonah. Don't go anywhere. But we're also being joined by, I believe, the Deputy Commissioner. I'm going to get your name wrong. I apologize. Kajori Chaudhuri. Pronounce it
Senator Krueger, you're almost there. It's Kajori Chaudhuri.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. I think you are sort of doing a filling in for Annabelle Palma and here to help with any questions we might have. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get to the questions?
Firstly, thank you so much, Senator, and everyone on your team. Like, we've worked for a few months now to put this together, and we really appreciate you bringing us in this space. One of the things, and I caught some of the last end in terms of what Ryan and Jonah were talking about. The way I see bystander intervention trainings are almost like first aid. We all learn first aid, right? Like we learn, we take, regular classes just to make sure that we are up to date with all the new techniques. And in our lives, we may use that, or we may never end up using it. But we build muscle memory that helps us use these tools when if that situation ever comes to it, right? So similarly, as you are part of this training today and as you leave, think about this in terms of first aid. This is very, very similar. And again, thank you so much for having us today. Any questions? Two of my expert colleagues are here. We'll all be happy to chime in. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, all of you. So we have quite a few questions. We'll see how many we get through. But some I think are really what we just talked about and learned about, not putting yourself in an unsafe position when you want to try to do something. So one question is about, what if you see a group of people harassing one person, which I guess is more like the story of a group of guys harassing the lesbian couple as they're strolling down the street. Is there any specific strategies that are bad ideas if you're outnumbered, so to speak?
Well, I mean, first thing I'll say is that, of course, safety is always the first and foremost concern. So we do not ever encourage anyone to do anything that they believe would put their personal safety at risk. That being said, if the individual does choose to engage the situation, of course, there are a number of tactics that could be employed. One of those tactics could be a distraction, which is not necessarily a direct confrontation. So again, like we've seen in a few similar previous scenarios, creating a distraction which is not aggressive or confrontational or likely to escalate, but which can draw attention from the aggressors away from the person receiving the attention towards you. Another example could be not to engage the group, but rather to engage the individual who, again, is the recipient of the aggression, just to create a connection and a sense of support there. And that in and of itself may be able to help. So those are just the first two things that come to me with regard to how to deal with that type of situation while considering, safety and de-escalation.
Great. So what if the situation is you think the police may be causing a problem or not responding correctly, and you want to intervene directly or even just to ask the police for their name and badge number and ID? How would you suggest approaching the situation when who you're hoping to turn to resolve the issue may be part of the issue?
So, you want to have really, really clear and careful communication with police because they're in an escalated situation and adrenaline can be flowing. They're trying to take charge of the situation and they're armed, right? So those are all things that raise the stakes. And in the kind of situation you're describing, Senator Krueger, where you're seeing some mistreatment by the police in that kind of situation, you want to act really slowly, clearly, and cautiously. So you can just within audible distance, but still physically far away, say, hey, I'm just recording this event. I am just recording this event. I am not approaching, I am just recording this event. So that would be a very basic thing to do that can really change the dynamic, as we've seen in lots of other situations, or at least lead to change later on if it doesn't change what's happening right there.
Right. So there, in one of your scenarios, there was a person, attacking another person on a bus, well, not necessarily with a gun or a knife. But what do you do if you find yourself in a situation where there is somebody physically attacking in a violent way someone else? The example a few months ago when an elderly Asian woman was beat up in the front of a hotel apartment building, and the doorman was right there, and he didn't seem to know how to handle the situation, and it seemed that people were walking by and ignoring it, and yet clearly there was violence going on. So let's say you're, you don't look like Rocky Balboa, so you're not sure you're going to take on the person who's beating up someone or has a knife or gun. but you want to do something to help and you don't want the attack to turn on you. How would you approach that?
I'll take the first crack at this and then colleagues have anything to add. One thing is, first of all, what we have taught you here is primarily de-escalation strategies, right? That means to take a situation that's really high feeling and adrenaline and where there's hurt happening of some kind, harm happening, and to get it to that less intense level where people start to like think and problem solve and be a little bit better, more their best selves. That's useful in a lot of situations, but it might not be really that useful, say, if someone has, God forbid, a gun and has a plan to attack someone else. That's not a situation where they're necessarily, de-escalation is going to reach them because they're coming with a plan. And so this training isn't really speaking to, say, God forbid, that situation. Now, for a situation where someone's using physical force of some kind and it's dangerous, you know, it's like, I kind of hold things in two hands right here, which is like, one is that everyone on this call, your safety really matters. And we all need to really make that decision first about, can I do this in a way that's safe enough for me? And the second thing is, you know, I could be that person one day, you know, and I would want people to look out for me in that situation. So that's a difficult tension right there. But, you know, at the very least, being able to know yourself, know, am I physically equipped for the situation? Am I emotionally ready to intervene more directly here? And if not, maybe it's a matter of, you know, oh, there's a guy harassing this woman over here. Maybe if I'm an older woman, I'm gonna embarrass those other young men who are just standing there and watching, you know, and say, you know, like, is this how you would treat your mother? What if that was your mother right there? Do something. And, you know, let someone who feels more physically safe and empowered to do that to step in.
I do think it's really important that you brought up again that this is a bystander training, and it doesn't mean that it's okay, how are we all going to be supermen and superwomen whenever we see any kind of crime in the streets in New York City, because, you know, there's crime everywhere and they're not necessarily the storylines, you know, that we're training towards. But I know as a woman, it's not uncommon to have gone through some kind of personal defense training at some point. And that often involves, you know, blowing a whistle very loud or screaming so that other people are aware something's going on and somebody will call the police, even if you don't think that you can't right then. Is that a model that ever works in this kind of situation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think self-defense techniques are really useful, a really useful complement in the way you described, and encourage people to take those classes as well. And yes, I think there's applicability to this situation as well. So, you know, get lots of attention on the situation, get lots of bystanders feeling like this is my problem too, and that can change the whole dynamic.
I actually loved your personal example before, that you got the guy to stop harassing the woman in the subway because you shifted his focus to that you were an idiot who didn't know the way to Coney Island, that you would take a long time to learn how to get the right subway, and yet his desire to show that he knew the New York City subway system was apparently a bigger issue for him than continuing his harassment of the stranger on the subway. So, you know, good. That was a great one. I will always remember that one. Thank you. All right. So this is an older person. They're saying 76, mobility issues, no illusions or delusions about leaping in as a superhero, as I just said. None of us are necessarily superheroes. But at the same time, really wanting to have the moxie to speak out. And just wondering whether there's any special things we should be thinking about as senior citizens if we find ourselves in these situations. Do we have a unique ability to de-escalate in some way, or are we just at higher risk of getting into physical altercations that we can't handle?
So I feel that most of the tools that we've reviewed today are very equally accessible to many different people. So, tools, for example, to document, to check in, to stage a verbal intervention in order to de-escalate. As Jonah mentioned, the vast majority of these tools are aimed at de-escalation and are non-confrontational and are non-physical. Maybe physical in the sense of physical positionality, but not physical intervention. So many of these tools would be equally accessible, regardless of somebody's physical ability or age, or other characteristic. So I would definitely encourage people, of course, to the extent that they feel comfortable and secure doing so, to take advantage of these tools, because again, most of them would be equally accessible to any bystander interested in staging an intervention.
So here's a question. So now we will step away from, the fear or threat of violence, but someone is being very vitriolic in their comments and actually racist or anti-Semitic. Is there a good way to start out trying to de-escalate from the onset? Sort of you come across the scene and you hear somebody screaming racist comments at someone or anti-Semitic comments or sexist comments. Is there like a good opening when you see that scene?
So actually, before I answer that question, I actually wanted to add something else that I thought of regarding the previous question also, which is that, something that we also spoke about is social positionality. So, who am I as far as my identity and my social position in this scenario? So one particular thing that I just thought of could be, if an older individual wanted to use their sort of position of authority as an elder in a community to communicate to a younger person, sort of a moral authority. That's just one, sort of potential way to use a social positionality. Now, with regard to the follow-up question about how to address somebody who is belligerent at the outset, this is a really important moment to use the tool that Jonah was discussing, which is match and lead. So the concept of match and lead is that you match someone's energy level and then build them down. So someone is being belligerent and out of control, you may have to raise your voice to match them, because they may not also be expecting, right? They may be in a sort of mode to try to victimize someone, not expecting that someone is going to come back with the same volume. So once their volume has been matched, now you have the opportunity to get their attention and begin to de-escalate, to lower the volume, to engage in language that is less confrontational, that's less aggressive, less offensive, until we are, stepping down the ladder to a more controlled environment. So I would definitely recommend the match and lead technique in a situation where someone is sort of belligerent or hysterical at the outset.
Right. You reminded me of so this you couldn't do this, or Jonah couldn't do this, but I do this. If I see, say, a group of teenage boys behaving badly in public in some way, perhaps harassing teenage girls or just behaving badly, I will look at them and say, I'm going to tell your mothers, and I know your mothers. Now, I don't know their mothers, but I look their mother's age. And so then the strange woman is hollering at you saying she's going to call your mom. You literally just run for the hills immediately. And that's worked for me several times. But again, I don't think either of you could pull that off. But if you're a middle-aged woman, you can actually get away with that with teenagers pretty effectively. So it's a model of de-escalation slash, I don't know, school marm, I guess. I'm not sure, but it works. So, but you're right. It's specific to, because I'm a woman of a certain age, that I can take that approach that might not work for many people, other people. And so another question is, I work with youth of color who are especially at risk. What should I be advising them when they're potentially getting involved in intervening because they are at higher risk of possibly something happening? And what might they have to do differently than the middle-aged white woman? I swear that question was already written before. It wasn't because I had jumped in with myself as the example right before. So what's your advice about how young people of color can get involved in de-escalating situations, being conscious of their role in society?
Well, it sounds like in this particular situation, this person submitted the question might be an educator. So thinking of it kind of from an educational standpoint, walking our students through these kinds of scenarios and through these kinds of skills, and having them ask, what makes sense for you and what doesn't make sense for you, right? So giving them that chance to practice beforehand, saying there's not one right way, just like we've done here. What's your position? How will you be safe, but still implement your values? That's, I think that really gives them an opportunity early on, or if they're your kids or your neighbors or something like that. I think that can be really helpful early on.
And I may add to Jonah, what you just said is we also provide an entire stack of trainings with young people, and the bystander intervention training is another tool that we work with, and we work with youth spaces, schools. So please, if you're working with young people and you think this would be helpful for them, please do reach out to us as well.
Great, thank you. That's very good to know, because we all wear lots of different hats professionally and personally, and somebody watching tonight might want to take you up on that for some other group they're working with. Thank you. So there's two different questions, but sort of the same issue. How do we actually find you? One person who wrote in that they've been told you leave messages at 311, but they haven't gotten calls back from the Human Rights Commission. And another who said that they had a case during COVID and they want to reestablish contact because I guess either you had to close down for some period or they couldn't follow up with you because of COVID. How do people get in contact with the Human Rights Commission? What's the best way?
We can leave our direct contacts. Like now we're here and you directly know us and have spoken with us. So we're going to leave our direct contacts in the Q&A, in the chat. And please connect with us and we can make sure that there is follow-up.
Thank you. That's great. I know everything got much more difficult during COVID when some percentage of us were ill, some percentage of us were not working from the office. And a lot of things for everybody got, out of norm, so to speak. Okay, let's see. I always think the perfect things to say when it's too late, so I don't intervene in a timely way. Is there anything I can do about this? I think we all go through life feeling that way, if we only had thought about it at that moment. But again, one of you were talking about that it's like exercising a muscle by learning how you would react in intervening. So it's probably thinking through the questions and answers even after you didn't do what you had hoped you would do, but thinking about if it arises again, what you would do, right? Any other helpful tips on how just have the right thing come to mind at the right time?
Yeah, just exactly what you just said and Kajori said, of like, do these kinds of trainings, practice it, getting into that muscle memory, and also when our adrenaline's up, it's easy to forget stuff. So that's why, like Kajori said, getting into that muscle memory, really just practicing and practicing. And if you can, using some techniques to ground yourself a little bit, like we discussed at the beginning, taking those 2 deep breaths at the beginning before anything else happens can get your system just settled enough to say, oh, wait, distraction. I learned about distraction, rather than, moving you from that first moment of, oh, heck, am I going to do anything? What do I do?
Right. Okay. This question, I think we go beyond intervening in bad behavior to actual criminal activity. How do you prevent harassment of disabled people? And the example given is a landlord harassing their tenant by blocking their path, following them, inappropriate comments, even grabbing their walker or taking their wheelchair away.
So in that case, please call us, because a landlord is obligated to provide not only, reasonable accommodations for someone with a disability, but also create an environment that is not hostile to the, and is also ensure that cannot discriminate against someone because of their protected status, disability being one. So if this is happening and the incident is less than a year old, please contact us. Again, you can directly contact any of us here, or call 311 and ask for human rights. We are also going to put our our online form as well as the other phone numbers on the chat as well. So there are different ways of contacting us, but we're here, our names, you have our emails, please directly contact us.
Great, thank you. So before it was advised, you might want to use your phone, which is now a camera and a video camera for everyone on Earth, and video a situation. But importantly, highlighting that doesn't mean you want to put it up on Twitter or Instagram, because who knows what you might actually be walking somebody into. But what do you do with that video after you have it? If you want to report it or say, this incident happened and it was terrible and somebody should do something about it, is there some place to forward your video to?
Well, first things first is just ask the person who was targeted and attacked, because I could say to you, yes, we do track a number of types of hate incidents, hate violence in the city. And that is this kind of thing that people frequently reach out to us about. Too frequently. I wish it wasn't happening, the events themselves. But before you do that, you need to ask the person, do they want you to do that in the first place? And it's their privacy, it's their face, it's their experience. You just need to respect that and trust them first.
This is a little complicated because obviously we don't really know what the cause and effect was, but what do you do when someone appears to be having a physical fit? Never having seen this before, I once approached the person. They were at this point jerking around on a subway platform, very distressed, and I tried to calm them down by touching their arm. But that resulted in the person grabbing my arm in like a vice, and I could not get free. I think my recommendation is probably you don't touch them unless you think they're about to roll into the subway, and you do call 911 for an emergency ambulance, because of course that person might be suffering from any number of illnesses that trigger these kinds of responses, and you just have no idea what it is. So I think it would be, that one's a 911 call, and try to make sure that no harm, that the person's not causing themselves harm just by the physical action that their body is taking. Any other ideas? Yeah, I'm not sure that it's exactly the examples we've been thinking about, but you do live in New York City. Anything can happen and will happen. That's my rule. You're living here. Great things can happen any moment of the day or night, and things you never imagined seeing can happen right in front of you any moment of the day or night. Okay, what about, yes.
I'll just say you can also take that first aid training that Kajori was referring to also. These are, complementary skill sets.
Right. All right, question. What about starting to recording things to the internet and telling him he's being recorded? Might he run away, or would he prefer to attack me? So this is as an intervention, starting to record what's going on and telling them that you're recording it. Is that likely to trigger the person, the harasser, running away? Or might they turn around and start to attack me instead of whatever they were doing? And as, quote, an old woman, I'm more prey than credible threat. So again, do you recommend that kind of direct confrontation with someone who is potentially violent, that you're telling them, I'm going to record everything and turn you in? Is that a good move or a not good move?
So, it can be very difficult to predict how a particular individual is going to react to a particular scenario. But again, it all comes down to, that individual who's intervening, their judgment of the situation and their sense of their own security. So that's really a question that the individual is going to have to answer for themselves on the basis of how are they assessing this individual? How erratic is this person? How likely is this situation to become violent? If that individual turns their attention to me, do I feel prepared to handle that situation? These are the questions that the individual will have to ask themselves in order to make that decision. If the individual feels that they're prepared for that aggressor to shift their attention toward them, then that may be a risk they're willing to take. If they do not feel prepared for that attention and aggression to be shifted towards them, they may choose not to do that and simply to document without, escalating the situation further. So that's just going to be a judgment call that every individual will have to make on their assessment of the situation, who else is around the aggressor, who they are in relation to the aggressor. I think that could be a good option, but it's a very personal choice that I think each individual would have to make given the scenario.
I'll add on to that, actually, just building on something Ryan said earlier is, it's not a deficit necessarily being an older woman or a senior citizen on the street. It's something you need to take into account, but there are strengths to it too, so like I'm thinking of my bubby Alea Sholem, who when she was alive, people just in public had a way of doing what she asked of them. And, so I encourage you, the person who asked, use your bubby power, like point to 3-4 people on the sidewalk next to you and say, take out your phone and record this. And then just think about how different that situation is if you have 3 or 4 or 5 people all spread out on the sidewalk recording the same incident. Think how different the choice is for the perpetrator than if there's just one person that they can hone in on. That I just think they're much less likely in that situation to try to resolve it by getting the phones from everyone.
Right. So there's lots of discussion often in the press and among New Yorkers that there are more and more incidents where people see mentally ill people on the streets who are acting out in various ways, including, unfortunately, harassing other people. Is there any specific recommendations on how to intervene if you actually believe that the person behaving badly is also suffering from mental illness? I mean, see often the reverse as well, of course, somebody who is perceived as mentally ill being harassed by people who see them as vulnerable and different. So I think both storylines happen.
Right. So I think that in that situation, I think many of the same tools that we've been talking about could still apply. I think a distraction could still be possible. I think that, engaging the victim of the aggression could still be effective. I think many of the same tools would still apply. Again, if the individual was acting in a manner that was more erratic, if the person intervening felt that their intervention may be less effective, we of course encourage folks, as I've said and will continue to repeat, to think about safety first. Your safety, the safety of the person being targeted, the safety of everyone in the situation. So safety being the first and foremost consideration. Of course, that consideration may escalate in this particular instance. But I also think that many of the same tools could apply. So I would just encourage folks to, to the degree that they feel effective given the situation, attempt to use those tools. But again, always being cognizant of safety first.
Thank you.
I'll add on, I just put in the chat a link to mental health first aid trainings that are offered by the city. So that can be another thing to add to your toolkit. And, to echo what you were saying, Senator Krueger, it's like being mentally ill is not really a predictor of violence. Sometimes mentally ill people, and sometimes people who are quote unquote mentally healthy, commit violence. The biggest predictors of violence is prior violence, is domestic violence. Those are the biggest predictors, and that's why we have this focus on what are sort of the roots of oppression and discrimination in this training.
Well, we have actually come to literally the last minutes. So I want to thank the 3 representatives from the Human Rights Commission so much for joining us tonight, for presenting the training. I think all of us are going to keep thinking about these examples and the suggestions you made. And I think we might even be running through ideas in our heads about how am I going to handle the next intervention that I see coming along? What will I do if this happens? So I think we all have new tools, and we are supposed to be practicing, although there is no test until life intervenes. So again, thank you all very much. I want to thank all our guests. In addition to our guests, my staff, who always make sure all of these are put together so well and go so well, except when I screw things up. I want to remind everyone our next event will be next Thursday. No, not next Thursday. 2 Thursdays from now, November 18th from 2 to 3:30, and we'll be focusing on Medicare program changes to the program, the basics if you don't know a lot about it now, changes you can make to your Medicare coverage during the open enrollment period, which ends on December 7th of this year. So please listen in there if you need help thinking through your options and whether you should choose a new option. Again, as always, continue washing your hands. Still avoid large indoor and outdoor gatherings. Wear a mask in public indoor settings, even if you are vaccinated. And remember to get tested for COVID-19 if you develop any symptoms or exposed to someone with the coronavirus, even if you've already been vaccinated. And I will see you on the next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.